Hello and welcome to the European Resilience Initiative Center video podcast. Europe is facing another security crisis. While Ukraine is fighting against combined forces of Russia, North Korea, Iran, and partly China, Western allies try to decide who and how needs to support Ukraine and what should be a wake-up call for Europe. How realistic it is for the West to pull itself together and finally start fighting for our own freedom and peace. We talked to Dr. Gustav Gressel, who is a researcher and instructor at the National Defense Academy in Vienna, Austria, and an old friend of Eric. Hello, welcome, Gustav.
Thanks for having me back.
Thank you. It's amazing to see you again on our podcast. And that wake-up call for Europe. My Ukrainian peers with whom I talk all the time, they told me recently, please stop using this word. We cannot hear about it. We have heard about epochal change of Olaf Scholz. We had about we stay with you as long as it's possible or as long as it's necessary. Now we are listening to your talks about a wake-up call. What kind of wake-up calls do you need in the fourth year of this war? Is it correct what Ukrainians are talking that another sort of rhetorics produced by Europe doesn't help but just distort the discussion?
Well, I can certainly understand the Ukrainian frustration, and I also think that the term wake-up call is inflated. It has been said that this is a wake-up call or that is a wake-up call for just too many times. We will see what the outcome. It's also unfortunately very true that Europe is very good about talking, but not very fast in acting. Now, that said, there are some few optimistic outlooks. For example, if you look into the most recently published IISS military balance, the assistance to Ukraine is gradually swapping to newly produced equipment. All the refurbished stuff is basically out of stock, or the time to refurbishment takes too long. More and more countries directly place money for Ukrainian defense industry to produce stuff, roughly because whatever you produce in Ukraine is 1/5 of the price of a corresponding Western product, either US made or European made. And bit by bit, we gear up to produce new stuff in our own defense industry for Ukraine, not only artillery ammunition. Now, is that enough? No. Is that fast enough? No. But at least it's a good trend. And in bad days like these, a good trend is something at least.
But when we're talking about production, it's all about capacities, what we can produce, what technologies we have, what money is allocated, what is also legally allowed to be produced. We know that in Germany, for example, I think in many European countries as well, no arms producer is allowed to produce weapons as long as the government has not issued a clear order to produce a certain type of weapons. Otherwise, it's a crime to produce, let me say, 200 Taurus missiles in the hope that the government will purchase them next year. So what is the capacities of Europe? It can be production capacities, but also capacities of using these weapons. We don't have like enough army for arms. If we produce in Germany like 1,000 tanks, we don't have soldiers for them.
Well, two excellent questions. So let me first jump into the production capability. And we have to distinguish between two modes of operating a defense industry. We have peacetime and wartime. And what is essentially the difference between the two is that in peacetime, you have a contract over X amount of vehicles or ammunition or whatever. And the company that produced them basically has to stretch its production run and adjust its production capabilities according to the orders it has and the time frame it thinks it can market a product. So, the most debated item is the Leopard 2 tank, probably. At the beginning of the war, KNV, which is now KNDS, has produced 24 Leopard 2s per year. And the delivery time for Leopard 2 was roughly 3 years. That was the pace because, of course, they had very few orders. These orders they had to stretch across a long time span because they wanted to market the Leopard 2 to many countries, so they had to consider that, well, the next pitch for a tank might come up here or in some years here. This country has a white book process. We might pitch some tanks there. So you start to stretch the production line. The opposite of that is wartime production. In wartime production, the government issues a guarantee that it will buy whatever the company produces. So like, let's take the Leopard 2. Like if the German government would come to KNDS and say, produce as many Leopard 2s as you can, and we will buy any of it. Either we give it to Ukraine, to ourselves, or we seek a buy later, but that's our problem. We will buy anything. And the company can make full use of its production capabilities. They can also give the subcontractors and complex weapon systems. You have 200 to 400 companies as subcontractors working for the main producer, producing small parts, special materials. Sometimes they don't produce anything, they just harden or coat something. Just if it's very specialized, you have subcontractors for that are just specialized on a certain process in their production run. And can them look, we can gear up and you can employ and you can start building things, because yes, the big companies close to the state, they could actually in theory afford, for example, to have an overcapacity. All these subcontractors, they're usually small and medium-sized enterprises. They have very little capacity to be elastic in their production capabilities and in their processes. And then, of course, after some time, not by tomorrow, but this needs some roughly most defense industry I talk to say it needs 2 years till they're fully spun up to war production. Then, of course, you can produce at a much higher number. For KNDS, for the Leopard 2, that would be 200 a year of the 2A8 version, which is more or less twice as complex as the legacy version of that tank. The Cold War production run were 300 to 400 per year. 200 with the new complex system would be what is possible now. So you see, in theory, if there were will and if there were money, it's possible. The next thing is actually creating new industries, because you say, oh, we actually should do more in this field and we should produce more munitions on that. Here as well, just look at Germany. It is the second largest producer of tooling and machining tools in the world. So if anybody sets up factory plans or plans industrial processes, sets up new factories, usually they rely on German tooling enterprises to provide the stuff, the machinery they need to produce, whether that's a civilian car or a combat vehicle, to set it in place. So also here, actually, Europe is not bad in a theoretically bad shape to actually tool up. And the European education system, in many ways, is, especially in Germany, in Austria, also in Italy, is very practically oriented. You have a lot of engineers. You have the dual education system. So on that, it would still be possible. The social thing, personal in our own armies, that's another thing. There is a weak tradition of volunteering. I think for most countries, they will probably have to bring back conscription, which also will take some time. But again, on paper, capabilities don't look so bad. Now, the problem is that first, that needs time. As I said, that most defense enterprises would need roughly 2 years to spin up to war production. We also saw that in artillery ammunition production. You know, they have their supply chains together, they have their chemical pre-products, sort of increasing the output of artillery ammunition. That needed 1.5 years to really yield results. Before that, newly produced artillery ammunition that were more token presents to Ukrainians, but you couldn't sustain them. If you look at the Ukrainian artillery situation now, it's much better than a year before, because of course now production has spun up. So the thing is, time is of the essence, and this is what I've been trying to preach to decision makers, that you should not, first of all, don't be swayed away by the illusion that this is a short war. It is a long war, and actually spinning up production will have an effect and will have a benefit. And the second thing is, you should not consider your decisions just what is necessary or what is needed now. You have to think 2 years in advance. How will your situation be in 2 years from now, supplying Ukraine or supplying your own armed forces? Because all these processes need time, and unfortunately that wasn't done. And unfortunately, of course, the penny pinchers still had their way. But yeah, it is still possible for Europe to be in a better position. However, if they would have started to really go into a war economy in the defense sector like Russia did in 2022, we would now be in a much better position. We basically could tell Trump and Vance, well, yeah, do whatever you think you need, but we are in this capacity to deliver. And the list would be long and beefy. But unfortunately, we haven't. The illusion that this will be a short war, that it will be over, there will be negotiations. Putin, they have so many losses, Putin will see that he can't continue the war. All these bloody empty phrases, they have prevented us from doing the right thing at the right time. And now, of course, we are in difficulties.
That are very important points you have mentioned. And one of them is the role of the United States. And we know that not all European types of weapons or systems can be produced without the US components. And we don't know what will happen now. 2 years ago, we were talking about Chinese-free production. Don't use Chinese components in your crucial equipment. Now we can start talking about United States-free components, because you don't know if the arms production will be stopped, because there will be no deliveries from the US because of some embargo. And besides of that, when we are talking about the wartime capacities of our production, these are, as far as I understand, please correct me if I'm wrong, wartime capacities without Russian hostile involvement, without shelling of our factories, without sabotage acts, without bombardments, without war coming to our territory. We can produce 200 Leopard 8 tanks if our factories on the whole supply chain will not be shelled. How can we deal, and is it at all a topic in Europe now? How we produce our weapons without relying on foreign components, also from our allies like the US, and amid active war situation in our countries?
Well, having ITA-free weapons, that was a concern for the French. That is this started actually earlier out for reasons of export and export licensing. But as you mentioned, the biggest problem in an event of war would be, of course, the Russian targeting of Europe's defense infrastructure. And here, there are huge problems. Not only do we have few enterprises, and they're all in a telephone book, so they will be targeted by missiles or by Shahid drones, but also for the armed forces. In the last 30 years, a lot of European armed forces, not to say the most, have outsourced vital maintenance and repair work to the companies that produce the item. That was basically done for industrial policy, to kind of grant these enterprises with permanent contracts to do something, as orders for new production vehicles and equipment was winded down. But the problem is that now, even for keeping the existing stock operational, you depend on these companies, and that the skills and tooling or field maintenance shops have declined. So the kind of vehicle repair that a German field maintenance workshop could do on its tanks and air defense systems and armored vehicles in the 70s is not the same as it can do now. But the problem is, of course, in a wartime situation, when you deploy your forces to the field, you need a lot of decentralized repair, maintenance shops, not only for new production, but just, a lot of stuff just gets damaged. It doesn't get destroyed, it gets damaged, and you can recover it from the battlefield, but then so what? You need the spare parts, you need the skilled workers, you need the repair shops to actually bring it back into service again. And there are huge bottlenecks on that for these reasons. And here, not only the industry needs to rethink, but particularly also our armed forces, the way we run logistics, our logistical structures, our depot systems, our spare part management, all that basically needs to be put, as Boris Pistorius said, on a war-ready footage. And that is a huge task. Unfortunately, of course, we pay a heavy price for the kind of peace mentality that has governed Europe for the past 30 years.
So now we are staying in front of what many experts, and you are one of them, call the pre-war situation, in the sense that our countries will be directly involved in war, not because we want to do it, but because we will be attacked. And the current sabotage acts, which are actually also acts of war, according to international law and the UN Charter, but not the acts of war as the broad audience expects the war to look like. They will be changed into a normal war like we know from the movies, or like Ukrainians know from their reality. What are Russia's goals here in such confrontation? How can Russia hope to achieve a victory on this battlefield? Is Russia about to achieve some sort of victory here, or is it a way that Russia just goes because they know that all other ways are just wars?
It's a complex topic. May I dissect it into sort of sub-chapters? The first is, of course, the aim. If your opponent has a certain aim, he will try to figure out a strategy and the tools to get it. And the Russian aims are not just to conquer Ukraine. Conquering Ukraine is a precondition for becoming the biggest military power in Europe, and the sort of the preemptive power in Europe, the power that rules the continent, that sets the rules, that conceives the order. And that is also, if you look, for example, at the Russian proposal for a new security order from December 2021, you see the exact aim. They want to have a sphere of influence. They want to reverse NATO enlargement. They want to kick the Americans out of Europe, and then they have fun with all the isolated parts of Europe. That's what they're aiming at. So we have the intent. Second, do they have the capabilities? Well, they have the capabilities to do a lot of bad stuff if they are done with Ukraine. What they have fielded in the army, well, now they dropped slightly beyond 500,000 troops to the field, but they had 650,000 troops in the field in Ukraine. That's deployed forces, not sort of the overall, everybody sitting in a bureau like me with a suit who is instructing at the defense academy, but like guys with guns in the field doing the shooting stuff. That's a lot. This force had 3,400 tanks. They have decreased because of losses and they can't reproduce so many, but that's a high number. 3,400 tanks operational in the field. That's big. 7,000 infantry fighting vehicles and armored personnel carrier at its maximum. Not now. They have declined. Ukrainians have dealt with a lot of them. 5,000 gun artillery pieces, 2,000 multiple launch rocket systems. 300 combat aircraft, that's the weak point. The Russian Air Force is very much sort of local infrastructure dependent on the air operations, and the pace of the air operations sometimes isn't very high. But, the Europeans struggle to get together a NATO response force of the strength of 300,000, which is half of that. A lot of troops in Europe are not combat ready. They lack material. The state of readiness of individual brigade isn't good. They haven't exercised for a very long time. The Russians have figured out how to use commercial drones, and these are pretty lethal. I mean, they're throwing roughly 3,000 drones a day at Ukrainian forces. Ukrainians, of course, have a high level of experience how to intercept, jam, shoot them down, how to tactically behave, not to be hit by drones. Europeans haven't. That would be, the first weeks learning this would be bloody lethal. The next thing is the Russians are aiming at sanctions relief. That's you can see that from the Trump negotiations and from the communications coming out. That's what they really want to have. Now, if they get sanctions relief, not only will they make more money exporting energy, they will also, the end of secondary sanctions will also make it much easier and cost-free, for example, for countries like China to not only give subcomponents and circuits and machinery and chemical pre-products to Russia, but entire vehicles. And even though they are probably from Chinese depots, so very old legacy Cold War stuff, that kills as well. We have seen that in the war, that you don't have to have the most fancy stuff, equipment for troop transportation, etc. Anything that is armored is fine. So I fear the Russians have the means to do that. Now, how would they proceed? What's the strategy? They would, to my guess, first and foremost, start to try testing the resolve of the West. Will the Americans actually come or not? Will the rest of the Europeans react or not? How far they will? They will set some isolated punitive examples, use maximum violence, especially against civilian population, to intimidate the rest, and then come up with the idea like, say, this can continue. We can take on the next country. Or here is the Peace and Cooperation and Friendship Treaty with the glorious Russian Federation. Sign it here. And kind of make this kind of intimidation and offer also to their very special crowd of Russian admirers in various, especially Western European countries, and trying to get their way. That to me would be the most conceivable path forward for the Russians. After, of course, they've conquered Ukraine, because the thing is, as long as they're bogged down in Ukraine and have to use this quite large army in Ukraine and can't come forward, they can't do anything. And this is also what people don't get right when assessing it. Is that how can you say that this army that just makes a few square kilometers per week in Ukraine will attack the entirety of Europe, which is so big and wealthy, etc.? Well, Ukraine is militarized. Ukraine has harnessed this resource for defense. It's mobilized. It has undergone mobilization. That's a different kind of opponent. Europe has not. We are still in peacetime. It needs time to gear up to be in a full wartime situation, even for Ukraine, where under the direct shock that happened relatively quickly. First mobilization, then the training. The first mobilized troops thrown into the front didn't do all too well, and it needed really some time till the late summer of 2022, when the counteroffensives happened, that Ukraine was really in the war footing. And what I told you before, there's time you need to gear industry up. There is time that we need for defense reform. There's time for restructuring. The Russians will, if they win in Ukraine, be in the situation where they say, well, we can watch the Europeans try to address that, or we can hit now. We can watch the Americans sort out their domestic problems. Maybe, they will elect a different president, or we'll hit now. And if you put yourself in Putin's shoes, the hit now narrative has a lot of arguments going for it. And that's what makes this situation so extremely dangerous. We don't know how the war in Ukraine will progress because of the uncertainty on the American side. There are big uncertainties whether Europeans will be able to continue to supply Ukraine to the extent it can continue an organized military resistance. There's absolutely no doubt that whatever peace or ceasefire Russia will sign, it will not adhere it. So that's for granted. So yeah, it's a pretty bad situation to be honest.
And what you have described recently, this Russia's concept, hit now, wait, and hit from the worst position, is exactly what we have observed in 2022, when Russia has clearly decided that it is not the best time to attack Ukraine. If you're looking for the perfect situation, but the perfect situation will never come. So now it's better to attack Ukraine compared to 2023 or 2024, when the Ukrainian economy will grow up a bit more, when Ukraine will get more people trained, etc. And regarding the capacities of the army to fight back, we can compare Ukrainians' capacities in 2022, when Russia's army was heavily beaten on several directions, and Ukrainian resistance in 2014, when Ukrainian army was not that good equipped, but has not fought at all because it was morally unprepared to shoot at Russian soldiers, to kill Russian soldiers, and if necessary, to die. And when we look at the European armies now, we can imagine that the Bundeswehr will not be, for example, the most dangerous adversary for Russia, and most probably the German government will more or less try to sign some sort of capitulation instead of risking destruction of German cities. But we have Poland, we have Baltic states, we have Czechia, who demonstrate their pretty much willingness to fight. We have Finland, with their huge experience of fighting Muscovy back. But can we be sure that some countries will be more successful in resisting Russia's aggression, or because of their geographic position, the Baltics will not be able to fight for a longer time just because they don't have strategic depth?
Yes, I mean, I think any country on the eastern flank, I mean, I have a particular relationship here with Poland. They will shoot back. But yeah, especially the Baltic countries, because they are small, especially in terms of population. They're not too small in terms of geographical size, but in terms of population, they're quite small. There's a limited base and how long you can endure that, and you need reinforcement and relief. And even if, there's a lot of debates about the state of the Bundeswehr, and I think it's not so bad as some people predict or as some people say. But the thing is, does it matter in the Russian point of view? I mean, look at the arrogance against Europeans, that they're completely useless and unnecessary, that is going on in Moscow. They had a similar arrogance against Ukrainians before 2022, thinking they will collapse. It's basically a puppet regime. You just poke in and it will crumble. And they were so, because of Syria at the time, they were so pumped up with self-confidence that I thought they would take Kiev in 3 days. Well, it turned out the other way. But the thing is, if you try that against Europe, they will try, because they have this arrogance still. If they would win in Ukraine, the arrogance will be boosted. They have this tendency of overestimating themselves. And even then, if you bite them back and you defend well, you will have a lot of Irpins and Buchas all across Europe. Because that's what happens in the first days. And you really should, the Europeans should go back to 2022 and visit these places and think, should this be our suburban space? Should these be our people? I don't think so. So, better be prepared. And if we are sort of with gunning up and with putting up a lot of armed forces, deter Russia from trying that, mission achieved. The best would be, gun up Ukraine to the point that the Russians will not try, or exhaust their ability to be even able to try. That's basically why all this support is in our own self-interest. I don't think Zelensky has to thank anybody. We have to thank him and the armed forces for doing this, because we would be the next in line. But sort of gratefulness aside, that is the issue of deterrence. You want to make the other party not even try this. That's what deterrence is all about.
Speaking about deterrence and gunning up, in one of your recent interviews, you have mentioned that you find it pretty realistic that many countries, including European countries, will try to build their own nuclear bombs and to gun them up on that way, which is legally a thing which many people think is impossible. Just think about Germany's treaties, which Germany has signed, saying we will never have nuclear weapons, chemical weapons, biological weapons. All European countries, if I'm not mistaken, have signed a non-proliferation treaty. Still, treaties, especially in a situation when the life is so dire and dangerous, can be revoked. Will we see surge of nuclear weapons in Europe, not in the world, where countries which feel unsafe and are not part of a military alliance will try to gun them up, but in Europe? And how realistic is it technically?
Well, again, we have to dissect that into many pieces. The first is the necessity of nuclear deterrence, and there is basically consensus in all across Europe, except for Ireland and Austria, that have signed the ban treaty, that Europe needs functioning nuclear deterrence. Now, functioning nuclear deterrence means that the opponent, Putin, has the fear that if he strikes and if he punches in, the other countries will put their existence at risk for the countries that are punched, like the Baltics. And up until now, they had actually the very firm impression that the Americans would do so. And if you poke them, then the big hammer would come. Now that is not the case anymore. And the thing is, with the rest of the Europeans, what do we have? We have the Brits and we have the French, both with very limited nuclear capabilities, but still nuclear capabilities. And the Russian thinking as well, they can do limited damage to us. We can wipe out the entire country of them. So in a confrontation, we will increase the threats and the saber rattling to the point that their public opinion breaks and say we can't do that because they will, even if our forces are able to strike them, they will wipe it out completely. That is also because the French and the British nuclear deterrent rests on very few platforms, basically one French and one British submarine at sea at a time. At high depths, there might be or a second submarine of one of the two countries at sea, but that's basically it, and a few French fighters. But there is, for example, there's no basing agreement, there is no maintenance infrastructure for particularly French nuclear weapons further east than France to really sustain, for example, French deterrence patrols somewhere in the eastern flank. So there are clear limitations to that. Now, what is the path forward? So there's the pure military path forward. That is, of course, within the legal framework. It will still be possible, for example, to have an increase of the French and British nuclear deterrent. The Brits have basically signed in the Lancaster Treaty that they will co-work with the French because they're actually using American nuclear weapons right now. They want to use French ones. The French still have production capabilities. They have a civilian nuclear sector, the Brits as well. And you can make arrangements that, for example, other European countries support this effort to broaden the arsenal in order to make it more flexible. The more flexible it is, the more credible it is, the more options you have to conceal your systems from the Russians, to keep them guessing where you are and with how much you are, and the more you can be confident that you actually have a deterrence value. And the second thing is, of course, you can quit the NPT and basically have larger countries that have the financial capabilities to also do that. And it's not only Germany. I mean, Sweden was very much progressing in its nuclear weapons in the 50s and 60s. They were very far in their nuclear weapons programs. And what made them actually quit and sign the nuclear proliferation treaty was, at the time, it was actually the Prime Minister Olof Palme. He was reassured by the Americans in the case of war with the Soviet Union, he would get an immediate request to base American warplanes in Sweden with nuclear strike capabilities in order to attack then Leningrad, now St. Petersburg, and the then sort of Soviet lines of communications along the Baltics. And in that case, when you anyway have nuclear weapons, Americans, in Sweden that can do the thing, what role would Swedish nuclear weapons have? And Palme said, well, you know, if they're redundant and the Americans really promise us that they will be there, I can well put the money into other stuff and don't have to continue this horribly expensive nuclear weapons program, which is what they did then. Now, of course, that rested on the assumptions that the Americans would be there, and they were not in NATO at the time. They were neutral or non-aligned, but they were not in NATO, and still was the American the American promise that, look, if things go sour, we are there. And if you look at the NPT, there is it is not only about nuclear proliferation; it also states that the legal nuclear states have to oblige with UN Charter and have to defend the UN Charter. And the Russians are blatantly violating every fiber of the UN Charter, and the Americans now, if you look at their communication, are not defending that. I mean, today they even didn't want to recognize Russia as an aggressor. So they are not living up to their obligations under the Non-Proliferation Treaty. So, of course, Europeans can say, well, guys, goodbye, that's it. You have not lived up to your part of the deal, and we will not live up to our part of the deal. Now, on the other hand, this is, of course, for countries, nuclear weapons take a very long time to develop. They need a lot of special toolings because first to gain a lot of plutonium and then to forge it into proper pits, that takes a lot of special stuff and time and costs, etc. So, of course, no European country would do that just because of a bad mood, or the prime minister steps out in bed and says, well, I've had it. But nevertheless, I think it's worth reminding our American friends that the nuclear privilege is not a free lunch. And that if they continue this way they are going now, which then they might turn heels, then this will be the consequence. That, I think, is something that would be helpful, because people like Trump and around him seem to have a very short-lived memory on history, and I think the genesis of the nuclear non-proliferation regime and the various formal and informal agreements the United States entered to make the nuclear privilege a legal thing are beyond the historical memory of the current administration.
In a case when more nations, more democracies in Europe will get access to a nuclear weapon, will it be a national step, or can we imagine that the European Union would get European nuclear weapon? The question is, of course, who will be in charge and how the decisions will be taken if one country, for example, can veto the usage of nuclear weapon.
So the European Union doesn't have an armed force on its own. So of course it can't have a nuclear armed force on its own because there is no armed forces that are directly EU. So they would, as things stand now, they would be French and British. Brits not even in the EU, but coming closer and closer back to it. A EU nominal nuclear component is something that is in a very distant future, to say the least. But what the EU, of course, can do is And we should do that, talk with the French and the British about nuclear contingencies, about deterrence, about the same stuff that a nuclear planning group actually does in NATO, to get everybody involved, or all affected countries involved in the discussion in nuclear doctrine, when to employ, how to signal, how to exercise nuclear weapons, so to have a coherent policy. And yes, of course, French Rafales can go on nuclear strike patrol and signal that to the Russians wherever in Europe. And then, of course, in such a case, it would be good if the rest of the Europeans are on board, know the procedure, can support this logistically, etc., like we did that with the American nuclear component in NATO. That, of course, is a thing that the Union can facilitate and provide.
And will we see some shift of military structures and defensive alliances from NATO in a case when the United States will continue to follow their at least ambiguous policy in their statements towards something new? And what new can it be? I've already mentioned the European Union doesn't have their army, but there are regional alliances. There is also an option to create a sort of a European army, or bilateral units like Dutch, German, French, German, Polish, and other battalions and brigades.
So in the immediate future, I think that regional formats are the way to go. We have a long-standing tradition, for example, of Nordic defense cooperation that goes as deep as to commonly operate systems, having common airspace control, basically jointly operate air forces. And here I think the Baltic countries might easily become just part of the Nordic defense cooperation. And then, of course, we have a bit of an issue in Central Europe, where we have Hungary, we have Slovakia, which are currently, at least for Slovakia currently, and for Hungary probably permanently, under a very strange government. The Czech Republic is very much looking for partners, maybe with Poland together. Germany also would have quite a potential to be a partner in a lot of things. The problem is, of course, I have to say that the last years, the political tiptoeing about pretty obvious decisions in Berlin have not increased the trust and confidence in Berlin as a partner. I have to say, well, that can still be changed. I still remember Macron inviting Putin to Brengalson, and look at the French now. So, never say never. I would have never guessed that the stuff coming from the mouth of an American president that is coming out of the mouth of an American president right now. I have to say, if somebody would have told me that some years before that, when I was still running around with the John McCain T-shirt, I would have told the guy to stop smoking weed. But here we are. So regional corporations are the most logical thing, because what is the need for that? We have a lot of small states in Europe, and the small states' armies run into problems of scale. For example, when you want to operate very important but high price capabilities, like, for example, electronic reconnaissance aircraft or spy satellites, small countries can't afford them on their own. But you can have many countries basically putting stuff together and then exercising this together. The next thing is actually exercising. For small countries that have brigade or division-sized armies, if you want to have a large exercise, you need to have a multinational exercise, because you have so small armed forces that you can only properly train in a bigger context. And that's the most immediate least. On that, I think, well, let's see how the Americans progress and what they do. NATO still has a lot of awesome stuff and good people, and and good structures. And, some countries just don't send officers to NATO anymore to hire NATO staffs and councils. They don't participate because they don't think it's their national priority. Turkey being one point in case, and the Hungarians have a very, very small and limited footprint and don't participate all too much in the organization. If the Americans would go the same way, which I would very much regret, I have to say, but it's conceivable, that will still keep the organization as such intact. You would have to appoint a supreme commander from a different nation, maybe it's then a Brit, etc. All that can be rectified, but you still have these people there. And actually, the same actually was after Brexit. A lot of actually what best and brightest EU diplomats I found in Ukraine and sort of program officers doing good stuff in Ukraine were UK citizens who stayed on in the External Action Service after Brexit. And I hope that, because there are actually a lot of talented and good Americans, that NATO will find a similar arrangement for our American friends who decide to stay.
With a look at all these very complicated developments and the lack of capacities on many fronts and the scale of challenges, what would be 3 steps which would be most important to be done by the Europeans in this situation?
In this situation, so first, to increase the support for Ukraine. It is struggling for survival, and it's the pivotal war that determines whether we will have a much larger war in Europe or not. We can't let Ukraine go and succumb to Russian pressure. The first thing is, of course, to increase our defense and intelligence capabilities in Europe. That decreases dependency, that decreases vulnerability against the Russian threat, and that is an urgent requirement. And the third strategy, I think, is to look for pressure points where you can put pressure on the Trump administration, because I do not believe that the Trump administration will change its mind because we talk to them. I have very little faith in dialogue for the sake of dialogue. But the Trump administration might change their mind if you confront them with consequences. That might work. And these consequences can be in the economic sphere, they can be in the legal sphere, in the financial sphere. Even if the Russians unilaterally, for example, lift sanctions against Russia, and invite American private companies to explore the mineral wealth of Siberia for the sake of American-Russian friendship and coziness, then we have to do the same thing that the Americans thankfully did to Nord Stream 2, apply secondary sanctions. And a lot of American private enterprises will look at the European market, look at the Russian market, at the North Korean market, look at the European market again, and make a decision.
That is the summary of this talk, very insightful talk with Dr. Gustav Gressel. Be ready, don't be afraid, and stick to decisions and to steps which are maybe not conventional, but are efficient and lead you to the goal: more peace, more stability, more freedom in Europe and in the world. Thank you so much. It was an interview with Dr. Gustav Gressel, who is a researcher and instructor at the National Defense Academy in Vienna, and an old friend of Eric. Thank you for having been with us. Don't forget to like, to share, to subscribe to this channel. Stand with Ukraine. And thank you, Dr. Gressel, for this interview.
Thank you very much for having me.